In architectural design, the demands of relating a building to a physical location are necessary and inevitable. The site is initially construed and finally achieved in the architectural work. When reviewing a site, there are two main considerations. Architects consider in terms of theory/knowledge, what we think the site is, and in terms of the impact of theory on action, what we make of a site. Sacred to the profane, specific to the general, and unique to nostalgic are all examples of understanding site. Overall, architecture comprehension of an area or terrain is meant to be suggestive, not exhaustive. Expanded by appropriation, divergent discourse on one hand. So now we find ourselves understanding site on a basic level, but there is more than one way to view a site as a shaping force. The main one being international style or functional modernism, which can be classified as universifying the act of site planning and issues associated with site, which leads to criticism due to the view of not necessarily focusing on the dynamics and issues arising from a particular area or given place. The phenomenon can best be known as the standardization of cultures. Vittorio Gregorti summarizes the argument: the worst of modern architecture is the idea of shape, considered solely in terms of its environmental and technical exegesis, indifferent to the idea of site. As well, Kurt Forrester quotes, "No understanding of site is conceivable without a communal history or conceivable with a consubstitution of that history." A subject of contemporary practice is the idea that something can be understood almost instantly without taking the proper steps needed to fully comprehend a subject, which proves true with architects and builders understanding site. Moving on, Burns also mentions two opposing conceptions of site, one being the clean site and the other being the constructed site. The clean site, put most simply, is an empty area not inhabited and empty of content. Taming, by development, can be understood through the processes of creating grids to mark off land. County boundaries of the United States 1860 line drawing is a prime example of such a practice, all of which is known as the Jeffersonian grid, which can be used as an example of geometry laid over land, nota subterraneum. The constructed site focuses more on the existing qualities of the terrain and emphasizes the visible physicality of the area. Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright is an example of designing to fit into the landscape that was specific to the particular site. Lastly, Burns brings up the notion of construing a common language within understanding site. Site means the local position of a building, town, monument, and so on. Lot is a measured partial of land, plot is a measured piece of land, context is the connection of words. Overall, Burns ends with the idea of region, which is an idea more focused on not generalizing site and focusing on individual terrains, unlike the overall international style we see today.
Jane Jacob argues that in order for streets and sidewalks to be successful, people must feel personally safe and secure using them. And in the difference between cities and suburbs is cities are full of strangers as opposed to acquaintances. Therefore, the street's main goal is to defend the city from harmful strangers and protect its peaceful strangers. Without safe streets and sidewalks, a negative chain occurs that hurts other parts of the city, and unsafe streets is a serious problem that can affect any part of the city, whether rebuilt or old, dense or spread out, poor or rich. And the fact that everyone must use the streets makes this a vital concern. In order for a street to be safe, it must have a clear division of public and private space, many watchful eyes on the streets and users on it fairly continuously. This can be achieved by adding stores and other public spaces that function during the day and night, which give people a reason to use the streets and sidewalks. The stores can also act as great defenders of the streets, and a large activity of people attracted to the stores will attract even more people. In his article, Robert Moses acknowledges that cities, as they become more successful, become larger and more populated, and thus become disorderly and crowded. Many architects are trying to find ways to surgically organize cities so that their functionality will increase. Eli Saroyan, a revolutionary architect from Scandinavia, suggested introducing the idea of organic decentralization. This idea is defined as finding the surest road to reduce the compactness of an overgrown city. This concept works successfully in Stockholm. However, when applied to American cities, Moses argues that it is hurting our architecture by advocating a philosophy which doesn't belong here. The process of organic decentralization takes years because American planners have to work with property rights of individuals and commercial property. Visionary Lewis Mumford created 6 stages in the cycle of a city that describe how a city starts and falls.
Eopolis, rise of village community. Polis, an association of villages or block groups. Metropolis, within the region one city emerges from the less differentiated groups of villages to become the so-called mother city. Megalopolis, start of the decline. Capitalist influences only increases the power and influence of the rich. Tyrannopolis, paralyzing economic issues too expensive to actually live. Necropolis, war, disease, and famine rack both the city and the country.
City planning is not something that can be done by a random planner who does not really know the city. The faults as well as the beauty of a city can only be discovered by people close to it. So the city will be carefully treated while being altered, instead of being changed entirely to a strange place. Building and planning a city takes time and understanding, much like how a person grows, a city grows as well. Record it for the grandson of your son. A city is not built in a day. Our little town cannot complete her soul until countless generations pass away.
Landscape is an important part of sight. The traditional way to view landscape is through the pictorial method, which compares landscape to two-dimensional naturalistic paintings where 18th century gardens are popular references. In this method, the focus is on how landscape appears as an image over how it works as a process. The construction and scenic conventions of landscape are based on two-dimensional techniques. These pictorial views shape our cultural views of nature, naturalness, and scenery. This is an inefficient method because it neglects important content in the landscape by only focusing on the idealized appearance of it and not the function. Therefore, 3 contemporary landscape architects have proposed new landscape methods that challenge the pictorial and focus on the cultural, natural, and social processes of landscapes. James Corner argues landscape is materially active and that landscape representations is visually made up of measures, such as control, lands, and faith, that affect and construct our realities and actions. Measures that guide outcome and assessment of cultural activity and meaning. He examines measures with aerial views, which show elements invisible from the ground like grids, and map drawings, which show elements that can't be seen visually and show how the landscape works. Both ways are synoptic, meaning they display conditions simultaneously over large areas, showing landscape as systems and organization and not a pictorial object. George Hargreaves relies on vision to experience landscape like the pictorial, but focuses on conceptual relationships over compositional ones. His many different representational views, when juxtaposed, challenge the reader to create their own understanding of the landscape. In landscape, he is interested in the cultural, physical, and historical aspects of the site over a preconceived idea. Open-endedness, meaning the landscape is de-objectified by extending beyond the site. Sensory qualities, besides site. Ecosystems and their function in the system of the landscape. An example of his site-specific work is the braid on the main campus of the University of Cincinnati, Ohio. Pathways were defined by the cultural force field lines of routes people already created. The winding pathways mimic the historical stream that used to run through the area. Aldrin-Goza argues his theory of landscape urbanism, where landscape is a strategy and network for development blended with the city and is a vital functioning process of the city. To him, a city is an expansive landscape that changes. When representing landscape, he is interested in space, time and cycles or evolution, like the evolution of the dune, and specificity of circumstances, like in his design for Schiphol Airport, where he planted birch trees, which have weak structure to deter birds from the site since they are dangerous to the aircrafts. We agree with Goza's idea of landscape urbanism because today, as the number of cities are rising and cities are expanding, nature is decreasing. So the best way to solve this problem is combine the city with the landscape, so they function as one instead of being separate. Therefore, landscapes cannot be looked at as pictures because they have to function within their surroundings, so they should be viewed as a process. In addition, architecture is not based off of pretty pictures and isn't composed based of just facade. That'd be ridiculous. So landscape architecture shouldn't be either. In addition, landscape, unlike buildings, is not permanent and stable. It cycles and changes.